We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which the production of this film has taken place. We recognise the great hardships of Indigenous Australians, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. On behalf of the Armenian Genocide Commemorative Committee, we welcome you to Australia's National Commemoration 106th Anniversary of the Armenian Genocide.
Հանուն հայոց ցեղասպանության ոգեգոճման հանձնախումբին գողջունենք ձեզ սիրելի ունկնդիրներ եւ կհրավիրենք միասնաբար ոգեգոճելու ցեղասպանության 106-րդ ամյակը.
We dedicate this broadcast to the memory of 1.5 million victims of the Armenian Genocide. Hand in hand, we dedicate this program to the over 5,000 soldiers martyred during the 2020 Artsakh War in the defense of ancestral Armenian lands. We would also like to honor the victims of all genocides, reflect on their sufferings, and recognize the resilience of surviving generations.
Այսօրվա արցանց հայդակիրը նվիրված է հայոց ցեղասպանության 1.5 միլիոն սրբատասված նահատակներուն եւ 2020-ի Արցախյան 44 օրվա պատերազմի ավելի քան 5,000 անմահացած հերոսներու հիշատակին, որոնք հայրենիքի պահպանության համար իրենց կյանքը նվիրեցին.
As we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, we remember one of the darkest chapters in human history, the organized, calculated, and systematic attempts of ethnic cleansing of Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek minorities living in the Ottoman Empire as perpetrated by Ottoman Turkish authorities.
Գուզենք մեր հայդակիրը նվիրել նաև բոլոր ցեղասպանություններու նահատակներուն, ցեղասպանության ենթարկված ազգերու դարաբանքին եւ վերաբրողներուն կոյատևելու իրավունքին ու բանջարդիրության։ Նշելով հայոց ցեղասպանության 106-րդ ամյակը, գուքանք հիշելու մարդկային պատմության ամենամութ հանգրվաններեն մեկը, Օսմանյան գայսրության դիրապետության տակ գտնվող հույներու, ասորիներու եւ հայերու թեմ ծրագրված եւ գազմագերբված ցեղային բնաճնճումի ահրելի ծրագիրը.
On the 24th of April, 1915, Ottoman Turkish authorities assembled, arrested, and deported over 250 Armenian intellectuals and community leaders from Constantinople. This marked the beginning of state-sanctioned massacres aimed to systematically exterminate the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire. This date always has and will continue to be one ingrained in the collective memory of the Armenian people.
1908-ին իշխանության հասած իթիհադական կուսակցությունը որդեգրեց ցեղային զտման քաղաքականությունը, թուրանական խաղապարախոսության հիման վրա։ Օսմանյան գայսրության դարածքին հայության ցանկավազային բնաճնճման գործողությունները կատարվեցան օգտվելով համաշխարհային առաջին պատերազմի քավոսեն եւ տաշնագից ուժերու պատերազմով սպառվելով հանգամանքեն։ 24 ապրիլ 1915-ի Բոսո մեջ ցերպակալվեցան հայ մտավորականներ եւ քաղաքական գործիչներ, որոնք սպանվեցան իբրև առաջին հանգրվան 20-րդ դարու առաջին ցեղասպանությունը նկատվող հայոց ցեղասպանության։ Այս հանգրվանը հաջորդեց 100,000-ավոր հայերու ծրագրված դեղահանությունը եւ բռնակախտը, զանոնք ավելի ապահով վայրերու մեջ վերաբնակցելու բادرվագով։ 1915-ին 1923 տարիներու ընթացքին 1.5 միլիոն հայեր ճարտվեցան, դեղահանվեցան եւ հասան դերձորի անապատները։ 1915-ին սկսած ցեղասպանությունը մեկ մասն էր թուրքական պետության քաղաքական ոգեկիցին։ Այս ցեղասպանությունը սկիզբն էր հայ ժողովրդի ողբերգական ճակատագիրին։
Further orders from the Ottoman authorities involved indiscriminate acts of violence that saw the mass deportation of women, children, and the elderly sent onto death marches where they experienced the unimaginable. It was the state's sole aim to entirely and permanently eradicate the existence of Armenians for simply being who they were. When the truth is reimagined, it can commit the same tragic realities that it once perpetuated again and again. The efforts that motivated the actions of the Armenian genocide has resurfaced today in its modern form. Once again, Armenians were forcibly removed from their ancestral homes when Turkey and Azerbaijan's neo-Ottoman leaders launched another attempt to ethnically cleanse the indigenous Armenians of the Republic of Artsakh, as motivated by the expansionist dreams of their forebears. This resulted in the occupation of the Republic of Artsakh, something we will not accept. Only through recognition, reparation, then reconciliation, we can prevent such crimes in the future. And only such can be done by understanding the past.
Անցյալի դարված բնաճնչման աշխատանքները դակավին կշարունակվին նոր միջոցներով եւ նոր բնույթով։ Անգամ եւս հայ ժողովուրդը իր պատմական հողերեն խրելու աշխատանքը գտանին Օսմանյան գարսության նոր ղեկավարները, շարունակելով իրագործել իրենց նախնիներուն երազները եւ ցեղային բնաճնչումի ծրագիրները հանդեպ Արցախահայության, որուն արդյունքն է Արցախի ներկայի իրավիճակը։
The historical bond between Australians and Armenians is everlasting. While the Anzacs were landing at Gallipoli in 1915, they were the ones who witnessed the Armenian tragedy, providing eyewitness accounts of the atrocities. Thousands of Armenian survivors from the death marches were rescued by Australian soldiers in a touching display of humanity, even amid the horrors of war. Australia's response, involving the country's first government-endorsed humanitarian aid for the Armenians, was an exemplary expression of values of compassion, generosity, and righteousness. These remain the keystones of Australian identity today.
Երկու ազգերու այս պատմական հարաբերությունը սկսած է Գալիպոլիեն։ 1915 թվականին, երբ ավստրալիական բանակը առաջին համաշխարհային պատերազմի ընթացքին ականատես եղավ թուրքական բանակի կողմէ իրագործված վայրակություններուն եւ հայ ազգի պատմական ողբերգության հանգրվանին։ Առաջին համաշխարհային պատերազմի մասնակից ավստրալիական զորքերը մարդասիրական օգնություններ դրամատրեցին Թուրքիո վայրակությունեն ազատող հայ քաղաքականներուն։
106 years on, we Armenians, along with our Assyrian and Greek brothers and sisters, remember, and we demand.
106 տարիներ անց, մենք հայերս, մեր ասորի եւ հույն քույրերուն եւ եղբայրներուն հետ գհիշենք ու գվահանչենք։
This year marks the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, in which some 1.5 million Armenians lost their lives. It is so important that the memory and legacy of this appalling event is honoured and observed. It's very important to the 50,000 or so Australians of Armenian descent, many of whom live on the North Shore of Sydney, including quite a number in my own electorate of Bradfield. But regardless of where people live, this is an issue of continuing significance. It's vital that here in Australia, in line with the position of so many other countries around the world, we recognise and acknowledge the Armenian genocide, so that, amongst other things, such an atrocity is never again perpetrated. Just last year, we saw the attacks against Nagorno-Karabakh, and that, of course, I know was an issue of concern to Australians of Armenian background, but to civilised and fair-minded people everywhere. So I join with many other community leaders in recognising this sombre anniversary and in expressing my gratitude to Australia's Armenian community for the extraordinary contribution you've made to our nation.
On April 24 every year we come to recognise the 1.5 million victims of the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire from 1915. We also remember the genocide committed against Assyrians and Greeks during this time. My hope and aspiration is that in the near future our own federal government will join many nations around the world and recognise these atrocities. In recent times I know millions of people around the world were shaken by the events in Artsakh, a stark reminder of what can happen when the world's attention is elsewhere. Those of us who are descendants of the survivors of the genocide can be grateful that nations such as Australia provided a safe haven for our parents and grandparents. In fact, our own Aussie diggers were some of the first witnesses and Australian charities some of the first around the world to provide assistance to those who were victims back in 1915. We remember the victims by being good citizens and ensuring that the world recognises these dark pages of human history.
In 2021, we mark the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, a period when more than 1 million people lost their lives for no other reason but for their ethnicity. It's time for the international community to unite and to recognise the wrongs of the past. Sadly, as we speak, in Artsakh, this ethnic cleansing continues, and again, the international community must intervene to stop this carnage. My very best wishes to all my Armenian friends.
Dear friends, Australia's foremost scholar in genocide studies, the late Professor Colin Tatz once said, "The Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide is probably the foremost example of historical perversion, with a mix of academic sophistication and diplomatic thuggery. The Turks have put both memory and history into reverse gear." Of course, we all know that criminals will inevitably lean towards shifting the gear of justice into reverse. However, the only way they can achieve this is if onlookers stop looking or if they look the other way. In the case of the Armenian genocide, memory and history can only shift into reverse if nation-states succumb to the diplomatic thuggery highlighted by Professor Tatz. If righteous nations don't pull up the handbrake, justice remains in reverse gear. Sadly, successive Australian national governments are guilty of succumbing to threats by Turkey, which involve holding the sacred memory and graves of our Anzacs as hostages for allowing its repugnant policy of genocide denial to continue unchallenged by Canberra. Australia has played ball, despite knowing that appeasing genocide denial means allowing the cycle of genocide to continue. In fact, on this, the 106th anniversary of the 1915 genocides of Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks committed by the Ottoman Empire, we have been reminded about the danger of the reverse gear more than ever, at least more than any time since Hitler used the Armenian genocide as an exemplar to commit his Holocaust against the Jews of Europe. Last year, the disturbing ideology that motivated the Hitlers of the Armenian genocide reared its ugly head again in the Armenian Republic of Artsakh. On 27th September, Azerbaijan's Ilham Aliyev, aided by his fellow Turkic dictator Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, armed by the impunity granted by justice in reverse gear, openly displayed his allegiance to the expansionist ideology of pan-turkism and committed 44 days of war crimes against the indigenous Armenians of the Republic of Artsakh, with the open intent to cleanse Nagorno-Karabakh of its original inhabitants. During the war that resulted in Azerbaijan's occupation of a key piece of Armenia's ancestral homeland, a Turkish defense official was asked on a working visit to Europe whether he was hopeful there would be a cessation of hostilities. He answered that for peace to ensue in Nagorno-Karabakh, there couldn't be Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. 106 years after the Armenian Genocide, unpunished Turkey is essentially stating that for the suicide drones to stop firing, for the cluster munitions to stop causing civilian carnage, for the phosphorus bombs to stop burning, there would need to be no Armenians left in their native Nagorno-Karabakh. This declaration was typical of the open threats of ethnic cleansing and genocide being spat out by the neo-Ottoman leaders of Turkey and Azerbaijan, as Armenians around the world, including here in Australia, cried out for the world to put aside all their oil and weapon deals, call out bluffs dishonouring fallen Anzacs, and recognise what was going on as military aggression and war crimes. Instead, there was silence, silence that breeds violence. Violence that has caused 100,000 Armenians to be homeless, 5,000 dead, hundreds of prisoners of war still in Azerbaijani captivity, and cultural and religious sites being desecrated every single day. Initially, our federal government refused to call out the Azerbaijani-Turkish attacks on Artsakh, like it refuses to recognise that 1915 were genocides. However, our community's intergenerational trauma, triggered by the attacks last year, led to unprecedented mobilisation, which ensured Canberra was left in no doubt that these denialist appeasing, attacker-forgiving positions are unacceptable to Armenian Australians.
For our Australian people here to recognise and to get to know exactly what is happening in our homeland.
Our community demanded that our government needed to call out that neo-Ottoman genocide deniers are trying to finally realise their repulsive dream of a pan-Turkic state stretching from today's Turkey to Central Asia. And their dictatorial leaders will rid these poor little Christian Armenians laying inconveniently in their way.
In Sydney, hundreds of people have taken to the streets to call for peace in the region.
Australian-Armenians worried for family and friends fighting on the other side of the world. They took to the streets eager to make their voices heard.
I'm emotional because it's not just a piece of land. For Azerbaijan, it is just territory, but for us, it's our heritage, it's our absolute existence.
Hundreds of Armenian Australians today marched through the streets of the city from ABC headquarters in Ultimo to Martin Place. Organisers say they want the Australian government to end their silence and condemn attacks on Armenians who are battling with Azerbaijan.
Our community marched, we protested, we advocated. Eventually, Australia shifted the gear of justice from reverse to neutral. The Foreign Minister said that the final resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict must be achieved under the auspices of all three co-chair countries of the OSCE Minsk Group, not only Russia, and that the principle of self-determination must be equally considered with territorial integrity and the non-use of force in reaching a just settlement of the conflict. Our community's advocacy on the Armenian genocide has made the Australian government's position of non-recognition untenable. The messages we have received for this 106th anniversary commemoration are from political leaders representing the government, opposition and crossbenchers. They will show that Australia has already spoken. We are just waiting for our government to join us. The elected representatives of the country want Australia to join 2 of its states and 30 fellow nations in recognising the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocides as genocides. The Joint Justice Initiative of the Armenian Australian, Assyrian Australian and Greek Australian communities has attracted over 40 parliamentarians to sign affirmations of support, solidifying that recognition of our genocides is non-partisan and near unanimous, just like 2 House of Representatives motions favourably recognised through debates in 2018. While Prime Minister Scott Morrison has again sadly this year succumbed to gearing into reverse on this issue by failing to accurately recognise the Armenian genocide, he has done so in the face of unprecedented calls for him to do what's right. His own parliamentary party, from ministers to backbenchers, his political opponents, state premiers, local councils, the Jewish, Assyrian, Greek, Kurdish and other community representative bodies, networks of churches and others have all called on him to recognise the Armenian genocide as fact. Rejecting this appeal to do what's right is short-sighted, morally hollow and not an enduring strategy which goes against Australia's proud reputation on important issues of human rights. Making the Prime Minister's position on this issue even more untenable is his own opinion. In 2011, as a backbench MP, Scott Morrison called for Australia to recognise the Armenian genocide.
Important we recognise the Armenian genocide for what it was. This is one act we should never forget, dare we allow it to ever be repeated.
Our community will hold him and his government to account on this issue, like all governments to account on this issue, as it is not only offensive because of our historical lineage, it borders on complicity as atrocities continue to be committed against Armenians. We will continue to march, to protest, to advocate, and through programs like the Armenian National Committee of Australia Youth Advocates, we will ensure this battle lasts as long as it needs to, until the handbrake is pulled up on Turkey's reverse gear, and Australia stands on her 2 feet and recognises what was committed against the Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks in 1915 as genocide. We remember, we demand.
Today, we pause to remember one of the most terrible tragedies in human history, the Armenian Genocide. 106 years ago, a horribly cruel campaign was carried out against the Armenian people, and 1.5 million people died. Now, around the world, an increasing number of countries are recognizing the Armenian genocide, and I look forward to the time when the Australian Parliament does the same. But today we pause and we honour and remember the victims of the genocide. And we also pay tribute to their descendants and the survivors who here in Australia, through their strength, their resilience and their generosity, contribute so much to the Australian community.
The history of Australia and the Armenian people is intertwined forever because of the events that happened in April 1915. For Australians, of course, we commemorate the Anzac legacy and the dreadful loss of life that Australians and our allies experienced on the shores of Gallipoli. But for the Armenian people, that month represents a tragedy of greater magnitude, the start of the Armenian Genocide, which saw over 1.5 million innocent Armenians lose their lives. That was a tragedy that resonated then, but to this day, because it has affected generations ever since. And today we come together to commemorate the awful loss of lives during the Armenian Genocide. But we also come together to make sure and remember that genocides that are not recognised only encourage perpetrators to think that they can get away with such heinous acts. That's why it is so important that on days like today, we call the genocide for what it was and what it remains to be. Of course, the Armenian people are one of the most resolute and determined people on the face of the planet. There is much that we can learn and do admire in the Armenian people of today as we do those that suffered so much back then. It has been a difficult time for the Armenian nation as it suffered under the impact of Azeri aggression, which has so brutally and ruthlessly taken the lives and dreams of those living in Nagorno-Karabakh. But whatever field, whatever era, We come together hoping for a more peaceful world, a world in which the Armenian people, in fact all people, can enjoy the respect that they deserve. So today we pause to reflect, but we also pause to look to the future and hope for a brighter world where genocides are not something that any future generation have to encounter. And we call upon the entire international community to recognise its role by recognising genocides where they have occurred and being resolute in making sure that they never occur again.
On behalf of the Australian Greens, I extend my heartfelt condolences to the Armenian community on the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. The Greens have long held the unequivocal view that the Australian government must recognise the Armenian Genocide and not languish with Turkey and other recalcitrant countries refusing to recognise this tragedy. It is only in recognising and remembering that we can ensure that the tragic events of history stop repeating themselves. To the families and descendants of the 1.5 million Armenians who were killed by the Ottoman Empire, and the 1 million Greeks and Assyrians who were also killed, our thoughts are with you. We will continue to be your steadfast allies in Parliament and in the community on recognition of the genocide and in condemning the current serious human rights abuses in Artsakh.
Today we commemorate the injustice of the Armenian Genocide 106 years on. The consequences of the Armenian Genocide live with us to this day. There still hasn't been a full and proper acknowledgement of the tragedy that occurred. We cannot remember and learn from an invisible event. With colleagues, we continue to highlight this tragedy in the nation's parliament, because when genocide is denied, healing cannot begin. Australians bore witness to the horrors of the Armenian Genocide, which is why it's so important that we acknowledge and understand it. Acknowledging the wrongs of the past allows us to move forward and say with confidence, clarity, certainty, and with action, never again. This is more urgent now than ever before, as we observe the renewed conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, bringing great hardship to the native Armenian population. Azerbaijani missiles have been bombing hospitals, churches, and schools. We've seen evidence of the destruction of monuments to the Armenian genocide by occupying Azerbaijani forces. Cultural genocide is its own form of genocide by removing and denying people their past and their legacy. Armenians were victims to the first genocide in modern history. We carry this burden, but it entrusts us with the determination to ensure that such horror is never repeated again.
106 years ago, our ancestors were systematically massacred and marched through the Syrian deserts to their death. In 2021, the horrors of the Armenian genocide were repeated, as we witnessed the indigenous inhabitants of the Republic of Artsakh forced from their ancestral homeland. Now, more than ever, we are calling on our community to make their voices heard and take part in this year's annual March for Justice. Sydney, join us on Saturday the 24th of April at 3 p.m. at the Domain. Melbourne, on Saturday the 24th of April at 2 p.m. at Federation Square, as we call on Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the Australian Federal Government to recognise the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocides and stand on the right side of history. This year we will be joined by our brothers and sisters from the Greek Australian and Assyrian Australian communities under the banner of the Joint Justice Initiative. United, we will stand for recognition of the 1915 genocides. United, we will stand against the continuation of pan-turkism and the safety of Artsakh. And united, we will stand for the preservation and safety of all our peoples. For further information on the March for Justice, including information regarding bus locations, please visit Armenian Media online. See you on the 24th of April.
Ով դեր դժմարտությամբ եւ արդար երբովրիր այս բոլորը մեր մեղքերուն պատճառով, քանի քեզի թեմ ապստամբեցանք, անօրություն կորդեցինք եւ բադվիրանները չլսեցինք, բոլոր ասկերեն ավելի դգարացանք եւ գդարաբենք ողջ աշխարհում մեկ, այս ժամանակներուն ոչ իշխան գա, ոչ մարգարե եւ ոչ ալղեգաբար, եւ ահա մեզի մատնեցիր անորեն խիստ եւ ապստամբ թշնամիներու ցերկը, փաստունով դեր Կուանունի համար մեզի հավիդյան մի ցկեր, քուղտդ մի ծրվեր, եւ քու ողորմությունդ մեզ մի հեռացուր։ Թանյել Մարգարեի խոսքերը այսօր իսկապես գխոսին մեր այսօրվա հոգեգան ապրումներուն։ Այսօր ցեղասպանության 106-րդ տարեթարցը ինչ երազվով կամ դեստականով պիտի նշենք։ Մանավանդ Արցախի եղած վերջին ողբերգության առաջ։ Արցախը գիհիշենք, որովհետև անիգա մեր նվազագույն հաջողության հույսն էր, որովհետև գիտիգիա պատմական Հայաստան Նախիջևան հայություն չէ եղած այսօր, իսկ պատմական Արցախի մեջ հայությունը գար եւ նույնիսկ իսանգախ վիճակը ուներ եւ այս վերջին 30 տարիներուն մենք այդ կարողությունը ունեինք բահելու եւ գործընթացինք։ Այսօր դեսիլք եւ երազ ունեցող ղեկավարներու գարիք ունենք, որպես ժողովուրդ պիտի սքանք մեր նահատակները, սակայն նաեւ ոտքի պետք է կանգնենք, մեր նոր աբակայի դեսլականով, նոր ծրագիրներով առաջ մղվենք։ Հետևաբար ողբամ մերելոց կոչեմ ապրված։
This is a sad and solemn time in the Armenian community when we meet together to recall the Armenian genocide of 1915. I've always been a supporter of the recognition of the genocide and the calling it out for what it is. When we fail to call out genocides for what they are, we sweep history under the carpet and greater atrocities are committed in the future. And we know that was the case with the Armenian genocide. As a Jewish Australian, it's particularly important that I call it out because Hitler, in his excuse for the genocide of my people, said, whoever remembers the Armenians. So in solidarity, I call out what was a terrible genocide by the Turkish people. I also call out the ethnic cleansing that is going on today in the Republic of Artsakh against the Armenian people that are there. As an Australian who's proud to know and be friends with so many Armenian Australians, I'm proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with your community on these important issues.
Tonight's a really important occasion, and it comes after the last few years where we have seen leadership. We've seen the United States Congress, we've seen the United States Senate recognise the Armenian genocide. They've recognised what truly happened. They've recognised the true history, and they have shown the sort of leadership that we need to see both in the United States but also around the world, including in Australia. When I personally first learnt about the atrocities that were committed against your ancestors, I was studying the genocide that happened to my own family, and I remember at university learning about the great Raphael Lemkin, the Polish human rights lawyer who coined the term genocide. And he was heavily influenced, and the term genocide was heavily influenced by the atrocities that were committed towards the Armenian, the Assyrians and the Greeks. It is a shared history, a shared common recognition of what has happened, and a fight that we all join with you on. So tonight I want to say thank you for allowing me to share a few words. I want to say that I recognise how difficult these last few years have been around the conflict and the difficulty that many of your family and friends are experiencing in Artsakh. I really wish you strength in these difficult times, and I commend you on your pursuit, your relentless pursuit of what is true and what is right and what is just.
Hello, John Alexander here, the federal member for Bennelong, which is the proud home of the largest Armenian community in Australia. I would like to pay my sincerest respects to the memory of the millions of Armenians, women, children and men who were killed in the terrible genocide committed by the Ottomans from 1915. Anzac prisoners of war witnessed the atrocity and reported it upon their return. They and the rest of Australia welcomed the Armenian refugees as they sought a safe place to start again after their suffering. I call upon the Australian government to officially recognise this genocide as exactly that, genocide, lest we forget. I visited Artsakh in 2019, where I was treated with the most memorable hospitality by the Armenian people. Therefore, I condemn the ethnic cleansing that is taking place there now. We must seize this moment to learn from history.
We commemorate those lost,
in the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocide. This was a precursor to the disgusting actions of the Nazis during the Second World War. I was first taught about the genocide by Professor Colin Tatz at the ANU. I was very proud to sign the Joint Justice Initiative's pledge to recognise properly for all time the genocide. It is very important that we tell the truth, and I was very pleased to see that the Premier of our state, Gladys Berejiklian, has also signed the pledge. We must tell the truth, we must recognise our history, and I thank you for your efforts in pursuing this important case.
April 24, 1915. Ottoman Turkish authorities began an organised, calculated and malicious attempt to exterminate the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek minorities living in the Ottoman Empire. This marked the onset of the first genocide of the 20th century, which saw the systematic murder of 1.5 million Armenians and over 1 million Assyrians and Greeks. What followed were state-sanctioned indiscriminate acts of violence, a murderous series of deportations, death marches and large-scale massacres with the purpose to end the collective existence of the Anatolia's Christian minorities. With few survivors remaining to tell the story of the Armenian people's plight, the only thing that remains are fragmented narratives whispered from generation to generation.
Each of the stories muttered from the survivors' and victims' traumatized recollections draw an echo to a similar foundational ideology sown by hatred, hostility and loathing. This is the ideology of pan-turkism, commonly referred to as pan-turkism, a nationalist movement that breeds violent intolerance to ensure the culturally and politically pure union of all Turkic people. In its personified form, pan-turkism eradicates the very existence of the Armenian identity, language, culture, history, and tradition that culminates into who we are. Recognition of such crimes against humanity, most particularly the Armenian Genocide, is the only way to prevent such crimes from reoccurring. It is the duty of our global community to learn from the lessons of the past, to protect us from falling into similar horrors.
Horrors that were tellingly relived in 2020, not recognising the past's harrowing realities, leaves room for humankind's most atrocious perpetrators to continue pursuing heinous crimes against humanity. 106 years on, the ideology of pan-Turkism that motivated the efforts of the Armenian genocide resurfaced.
Azerbaijani authorities, they implemented a policy of ethnic cleansing, and this was also genocidal policy towards the population of Artsakh, and not only Artsakh but also population of Armenia.
7 o'clock in the morning, the entire country, capital Stepanakert was one of the most important targets. This war is actually the result of the plans, criminal plans and visions of Turkey, combined visions of Turkey, Azerbaijan and international terrorists.
Between September and November 2020, Armenians were once again forcibly removed from their ancestral homes when the neo-Ottoman leaders of Turkey and Azerbaijan, motivated by the expansionist dreams of their forebearers, launched another attempt to ethnically cleanse the indigenous Armenians of the Republic of Artsakh, a self-determined state in the region known as Nagorno-Karabakh.
The Azerbaijani offensive began with revelations of Aliyev dictatorship's deployment of Turkish-funded Islamist terrorist mercenaries from Syria to participate in the attacks on the Armenians of Artsakh. This has been a well-documented fact, with the authenticity of the information being confirmed by European, Armenian and Russian authorities.
Very wide use of terrorists and mercenaries hired from northern parts of Syria, from Libya, from Afghanistan, etc. And I have even to say that there are even two criminals right now in Armenia who were arrested and taken during the war.
With the assistance of modern warfare, Azerbaijan committed countless human rights violations that constitute war crimes, including the use of cluster munitions against civilian targets and infrastructure, the use of white phosphorus bombs, and the publication of prisoner of war executions.
The abuses are almost in every sphere. They used, for example, forbidden weaponry. They targeted civilian objects. They destroyed schools. They destroyed hospitals. They were killing prisoners of war. For example, there are some data which should be, of course, proved. This is why we always say that international organizations must have access to our prisoners of war, that the Azeri and Turkish side are selling the organs of our prisoners of war and hostages. This is why Azerbaijan does not publish the exact number of hostages. It denies, but we know that there are a lot of such people. This is why we call upon the international community to go and to fix and try to somehow influence the behavior of Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijani forces unleashed suicide drones, tanks, and long-range artillery, breaching the agreements of the non-use of force under which the OSCE Minsk group co-chairs had been negotiating the peace process. And the result of their actions? Silence from the international community. The occupation of over 70% of Armenia's homeland in Nagorno-Karabakh, the death of over 5,000 soldiers.
The Azerbaijani authorities try to keep away all legal instances, and they create all the time obstacles for many international organizations through many political, steps in, and they act here in close cooperation also with Turkish authorities, I have to say.
The international community was very passive after 1915 genocide. There was no response on a political level as something, international, as an international institution. This is why there was a domino effect. Now we have the same situation, and very few countries condemn such kind of genocide. This means that we may think, and we could be sure that that genocide would continue in other places too.
Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh now find themselves displaced from the homes that their families had inhabited for a millennia, once again seeking refuge in a foreign land that are not their own.
We have about 100,000 internally displaced persons, more than 100,000, and 40,000 out of them left without their home. As a result of the war, they created the humanitarian crisis. I have to say that as a result of the war, we had 30,000 children who were deprived of education, and 20 generally, and internally displaced, and 24,000 out of them are children who remained out of the possibilities of any schools.
Armed by the impunity afforded by their Ottoman Empire predecessors, the modern-day leaders of Turkey and Azerbaijan are one step closer to finishing what those before them had begun: to remove the only Christian nation standing in the way of a greater Turkish nation.
Artsakh is still alive. Well, we are wounded, were severely wounded, but were still alive and were resolute to continue this path, this mission, especially now when so many people perished, when each adult, each normal person, adult person, is somehow ashamed of being alive, when there are so many young people in our soil. You see, it's a mission which we have to carry out. We don't have any other alternative.
Azerbaijan directly attacked cultural and religious Armenian sites in Artsakh, underpinning their intent to complete indigenous Armenians' erasure from the region. Destruction was deployed through physical means and also involved cultural reappropriation of Armenian history, calling the land indigenous to the Christian Albanians from the Caucasus, not the Armenians.
They're just destroying everything. And what is more, Azerbaijani president himself gives appropriate commands. For example, he said that these medieval Armenian churches and the inscriptions are fake. The Armenians carved these inscriptions 2 weeks ago. Go and destroy it. So what they want to do is just to erase everything which indicates that this or that settlement of territory is historically Armenian land.
Azerbaijani occupation of Artsakh continues to erode the very culture of the Armenian people. This state-sanctioned desecration of Armenian religious institutions, historical memorials, works of art, graves and religious monuments are the continuation of the actions undertaken by their Turkic brothers over 100 years ago. Before the Armenian Genocide of 1915, Armenia had listed 2,549 religious sites under its control, including more than 200 monasteries and 1,600 churches. Foreshadowing the harrowing events of 2020, less than half these sites exist in varying condition.
Armenophobia and spreading hatred is being carried out. And this policy is well grounded. It has institutional grounds, and it is based on hatred, based on ethnic and also religious components, religious grounds. And this is a clear genocidal policy.
What happened in 1915 and what is happening now are perverse violations of human rights that continue to go unpunished. When Armenians ask for empathy, why do they receive apathy? Today, more than 10 million Armenians live in exile, unable to return to the lands and mountains that their ancestors had inhabited for thousands of years. The Armenian Australian community is still waiting for the promise of justice and recognition to be delivered. We will do what we can, when we can, to ensure that our voices are heard, to represent those who are not being listened to.
Despite adversity, Armenians continue to rise, they continue to fight, and they continue to stand tall. We fight for our survival. That is all that we have done and all that we will continue to do. We fight to see a better tomorrow, despite the work of those who wish to make today our last. The world will not silence us, as we have felt before, because now, more than ever, we face the same existential threat that wished for our extermination not too long ago.
May we continue to remember the past, to ensure that it is not repeated in the future.
We pay our respects to those who sacrificed their lives to ensure that Armenians can continue to live and breathe to see a better tomorrow.
We must remember to speak loud, to remind all Armenians that their stories will never be forgotten. They will continue to be passed from generation to generation. But this time, their narratives will not be relinquished in fragments or whispers. They will be louder than ever before to ensure that justice is delivered where justice is deserved. We must keep fighting. There is so much more left to do, not for ourselves, but for our children and their children, so that they can also grow tall with the pride of their ancestors sitting on their shoulders, reminding them that they always are and always will remain Armenian.
Սիրելի հայրենագիտներ, գերգին անգամը այս դարի եւս ցեզի հետ գմիանանք հիշադակելու մեր 1.5 միլիոն նահատակ։ Այս տարի կուզեմ իմ աղոթներս բարձրացնել ցեր հետ միասին աղոթենք մեր հայրենիքին համար, մեր Արցախի ժողովրդին եւ զոհերուն համար։ Կուզեմ աղոթել մեր սփյուռքին համար, մեր ասկին համար, որ Աստված շնորհե բոլորին սեր եւ միություն։ Այս արիթով եւս կուզեմ իմ աղոթներս բարձրացնել հարուցյալ Քրիստոսին, որ Աստված մեզի նոր սերունդ մտա, քաչ սերունդ մտա, այս սերունդը կիդնա ինչպես ապրի ու մեռնի հայրենիքի համար։
Today marks a solemn time as we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. We remember the horrific crimes that witnessed Ottoman Turkey systematically murder 1.5 million Armenians and 1 million Assyrians and Greeks, simply because of their ethnicity. We also remember the efforts of Australians providing aid to the survivors and orphans in Australia's first ever international humanitarian effort. We recognise the barbarity and stand shoulder to shoulder with these communities in calling for appropriate recognition for what occurred. Genocide. The failure to recognise the Armenian genocide allows the same hateful ideology to re-emerge as it has during Azerbaijan's and Turkey's attacks on the indigenous Armenians of the Republic of Artsakh in 2020. The 44 days of attacks against the Armenian people reveals that the lessons of the past have not been learned, and therefore we witness similar atrocities 100 years later. On this anniversary, let us reflect on the past, commemorate the victims, and formally recognise what occurred. Genocide. Further, let us vow to fight the evil of all genocidal ideologies.
Hi, today we are commemorating the 106 years of the atrocities that took place in 1915 against the Armenian, Assyrians and Greek people of Asia Minor and throughout Turkey. We know that there has been no formal apology, and we know that it has been recognised in many parliaments that a genocide took place. I too will be doing my bit for the Australian Parliament to recognise the genocide of 1915. Many people have made their homes descendants of those people here in Australia, and our condolences and thoughts go out to those people. We also need an official apology. We can see how powerful an apology can be, no matter how long time has passed, as we saw with our Sorry Day here in Australia. So this would go a long way in healing the wounds and ensuring that atrocities that took place in 1915 against the Greeks, Assyrians and Armenians never ever happens again. My condolences go out to all those descendants.
On the occasion of the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, I would like to pay my respects to the Armenian community, whose contribution to Australia is so huge and massive. Your community has made Australia what it is today. This is a very important occasion for you, and for indeed all of humanity. For when one of us is hurt, all of us is hurt. And on this day, I pay my respects to Armenia and its people.
Hi, I'm Mike Freelander, the Federal Member for Macarthur in southwest Sydney. I'd like to give my support to the Armenian people on this time at the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, a very significant event in world history which has largely gone unrecognised. I give my support to the Armenian people, and I ask that the Australian government does recognise the Armenian genocide and the terrible event that it was. We must call out human rights abuses wherever and whenever they occur, and this is a very important thing for the Armenian people. I'm also concerned about the events recently with the conflict between Azerbaijan and the Armenian people. I urge both sides to try and reconcile this conflict and reconcile peacefully. I give my support once again to the Armenians and the terrible times they've had through world history, and I have met with the Armenian youth delegation and I support their aims. Thank you.
Today we commemorate the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. While I am disappointed the pandemic means we cannot be together, I am proud to lend my support to seeing the Armenian Genocide properly recognised around the world. On this day, 106 years on, we honour the memory of the 1.5 million Armenian ancestors massacred during the Ottoman committed genocides in 1915. The consequences and painful memory of the genocide still runs deep within the hearts and minds of all Armenians around the world. In fact, the Anzacs were the witnesses to these crimes when they landed at Gallipoli, and Australia's first major international assistance package was directed towards setting up orphanages for those children who lost their family through the genocide. It is so important that societies speak openly and freely about atrocities committed in the past. For while we cannot change what has already happened, if we ignore history, then we are doomed to repeat it.
106 years ago, our ancestors were systematically massacred and marched through the Syrian deserts to their death. In 2021, the horrors of the Armenian genocide were repeated, as we witnessed the indigenous inhabitants of the Republic of Artsakh forced from their ancestral homeland. Now, more than ever, we are calling on our community to make their voices heard and take part in this year's annual March for Justice. Sydney, join us on Saturday the 24th of April at 3 p.m. at the Domain. Melbourne, on Saturday the 24th of April at 2 p.m. at Federation Square, as we call on Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the Australian Federal Government to recognise the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocides and stand on the right side of history. This year we will be joined by our brothers and sisters from the Greek Australian and Assyrian Australian communities under the banner of the Joint Justice Initiative. United, we will stand for recognition of the 1915 genocides. United, we will stand against the continuation of pan-turkism and the safety of Artsakh. And united, we will stand for the preservation and safety of all our peoples. For further information on the March for Justice, including information regarding bus locations, please visit Armenian Media online. See you on the 24th of April.
Բոլորս կգիտակցենք, որ անցող դարին բավական դժվար դարիմը եղավ դարբեր ձևերով։ Դժվար դարիմը եղավ տնտեսական կետնի վրա, դժվար դարիմը եղավ առողջապահական կետնի վրա, ինչպես նաև իբր հայ ազգ դժվար դարիմը եղավ ազգային կետնի վրա, անշուշտ նկատի առած Արցախի հարցը։ Բայց այս մեկը չի նշանակի, որ մենք պետք է հուսահատենք, ընդհանրակը հավատամ, որ նորոգված գամքով մենք մեր ազգային բանջարդիրությունը հարաճ պետք է մղենք։ Հատկապես այս շրջանին, որ մենք կպատրաստվենք ապրիլյան եղերնի նահատակներուն ոգեգոճումը կատարելու։ Ուստի իմ գոչս է, որ ինչպես ասենք նորոգված գամքով, ինչպես նաև միացյալ չանկով այս աշխատանքը մենք հարաճ պետք է դանենք։ Դերը մեր հետն է, աղոթող ենք ցեզի համար։
Parev. I'm Jonathan O'Day, Speaker of the Legislative Assembly in the New South Wales Parliament and the member for Davidson in the Berejiklian Government. I also chair the Armenian Australian Friendship Group in our Parliament. In that capacity, together with Deputy Chair Walt Secord, I recently wrote to the federal government supporting humanitarian assistance for displaced people of Armenian heritage from Nagorno-Karabakh, where calls for self-determination have been inappropriately countered with military force from Azerbaijan. Our friendship group has also written to the Prime Minister again calling for the federal government to recognise the Armenian genocide of more than a century ago, just as the New South Wales Parliament did in both 1997 and 2013. While coronavirus makes it difficult to meet personally, I'm with you in spirit, as are the souls of hundreds of thousands of Armenians cruelly killed as part of the Armenian genocide that we commemorate today. Astvaz Hokanin Lusavore.
I, Victor Dominello, Minister for Digital and Minister for Customer Service, can I lend my support to the millions of Armenians and supporters around the world who are seeking recognition of the atrocities of the Armenian genocide over 106 years ago. We must acknowledge the atrocities of the past so that we can learn and move forward. On that note, I want to condemn the state of Azerbaijan for the ethnic cleansing that is taking place right now. It is just appalling that in the 21st century we're seeing these acts, these barbarous acts. And I encourage other leaders to stand up and again condemn these atrocities. I encourage you to move forward and to continue to raise the cause of Armenians and the genocide that took place all those years ago, because it is not just important for Armenians, it's important for humanity. Thank you for all that you do.
Over the years, I've established many deep friendships within the Armenian community, and I've been privileged and honored to gain an insight into the Armenian people and how they survived the genocide. I visited Armenia on 2 separate occasions, as well as visiting Georgia, Western Armenia, including Kars, Van, Ani, Masis, and Poker Masis. And I again hope to visit the region in a post-COVID environment. In December 2011, I was the first Australian MP to visit Artsakh. I had the honor to also place a wreath at the National Genocide Museum in Yerevan. I'm on the record in Parliament, in the community, speaking about the need to recognize the Armenian genocide, the right to self-determination of the people of Artsakh, and the need to support the Republic of Armenia. I pray that one day there will be a lasting and long peace in the region, that there will also be peace in which Turkey recognizes Armenia and the Armenian genocide, Artsakh has self-determination, and Azerbaijan is at peace with Armenia. On that note, I would like to take the opportunity to put my effort and support behind moves to get the Australian government to recognize the Armenian genocide. It is time. It is time that Australia recognized and joined the more than 30 nations around the world, including Canada, recognizing the Armenian genocide. I wish to also take this opportunity to express my support with the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh.
This year we mark the 106th anniversary of the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. Hundreds of thousands of men, women and children who were murdered for no other reason but because of their Christian faith and their ethnic background. We remember them. We pay homage to those martyrs. But we also remember that, and we know that, the genocide didn't end in 1915. It continues today. It continues on the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Republic of Artsakh. We see it in northern Iraq and Syria, and the oppression which those people face on a daily basis. It is time that the Australian government recognised the genocide. It is time that the Australian government acted and supported and protected those people in the Middle East and other places who are Armenian, who are Assyrian, who are basically being persecuted for their faith and their ethnic backgrounds. Today I remember and I pledge to always remember the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek genocide.
Today marks a solemn time in the Armenian Australian community as it commemorates the 106th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, a crime which saw Ottoman Turkey systematically murder 1.5 million Armenians as well as 1 million Assyrians and Greeks simply because of who they were. I, as a Member of Parliament, as a community leader, stand shoulder to shoulder with these communities in calling for justice, in calling upon the federal government to stand on the right side of history and recognise the Armenian genocide for what it was, a genocide. When we fail to learn lessons of the past, we're doomed to repeat them.
In the city of Adana, during the darkest day of the Ottoman Empire, there began a tragedy that marked the start of what was to become known as the Armenian Genocide. The people of Armenia were forced into starvation, torture, and extermination. Armenian homes were burned to the ground. Men, women, and children were killed. Sometimes entire families were wiped out. They were accused, convicted, and sentenced to die because they dared to call themselves Christians. The crime was in believing in Jesus Christ who died for their sins. In 1915, 1.5 million Armenians were ruthlessly slaughtered because they would not renounce their faith in Christ. Unpunished and undeterred, the ones responsible for the massacre in Adana set the stage for the terrible genocide of the Armenian people. This is our story. From the morning sun till the day was done, fathers worked until their strength was gone. In the summer air, under mother's care, children played within the village square. Through the soil and sand, farmers worked the land, gathering what they grew by their own hand, living day by day, trying to make the way. I know whether Christ did someday. Keep us of the sword, march with one accord, striking down the weak without a single word. Ruthlessly they came with one deadly aim. Kill all who believe in Jesus' name. In the shroud of night, families took their flight, all protected by the soldier's might. Hungry and alone, starved to skin and bone, forced to sleep on pillows made of stone. Wandering in the rain, trembling from the pain, cries for mercy offers up in vain. Naked and afraid, Though persecuted, they were not abandoned as they laid down their earthly lives. They would gain eternity with Christ. Though the world may forget, God will remember their suffering. Never again would they hunger or thirst. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, would be their shepherd who would lead them to the spring of living water, and God would wipe away every tear for their eyes. They would encircle the throne of God singing to the great I Am, worthy is the Lamb, who was and is to come.